All right, let's get going. Welcome. I'm Steve Hammer. I'm the manager of the newly renamed Climate Analytics and Advisory Services team. The climate CCSA had a realignment announced in December, and so we're in the midst of working through that. This fits squarely, today's topic fits squarely into what we're trying to do, both in terms of the larger questions of how the bank engages on big research questions and then integrates the learning from that back into our operations and the advisory services work that we're doing. So I'm very pleased that we can kick this off and that this builds on a session that several of our experts had this morning related to this research project that we're currently involved in, looking at links between climate change and migration. Today's session is part of our PPCR, the pilot program on climate resilience learning series. For those of you who are not familiar, the PPCR is one of the activities supported by the Climate Investment Funds, the CIF, and it seeks to mainstream climate resilience into national development strategies. It also obviously links very closely to the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, these policy statements or commitments that countries made in the run-up to or immediately after Paris, COP21 in Paris. There's a lot of work going on related to NDCs in the bank. We have a new support facility, or essentially a trust fund, that we were generously given money by one of our donors, by the German government, to support implementation work on the ground to help countries deliver on the targets or commitments that they made in their NDCs. And so that covers adaptation issues as well. And one of the things, we've had several conversations over the last few weeks about this, and things like the PPCR are actually very informative in terms of helping us from a country engagement perspective, the identification or clarification of how we actually deliver on commitments or targets that countries have established. And then most importantly and most relevant to some other big global initiatives that are getting underway, how the donor community, how multilaterals like us or different UN agencies can better collaborate or coordinate our work so that it's a bit more seamless, so that it's more efficient in terms of how resources are used, so that there's better sequencing of work or better co-financing of work on the ground. And seems kind of obvious, frankly, that we would achieve that's how we should conduct business. But it's actually really hard from an institutional perspective, given the priorities, that each of our institutions face, and just the bureaucratic or operational realities of how different institutions do things and the relationships that we may have with our clients, who should be central to this coordination conversation and steer it in a very important way. Now, one of the things we see coming out of the NDCs, and I think we're seeing strong links between that and this research project, which we launched, we started thinking about it systematically over a year ago, and that was to understand how climate change is, we've all known through the Turn Down the Heat series, through other projects we're involved in, that there are going to be some serious impacts and it's going to adversely affect economy, it's going to affect livelihoods, what have you. But what does that really translate to in aggregate? And are we going to have forced migration? Are ecosystems going to collapse? And that means that large numbers of people will end up having to move elsewhere within the country or out of country. And what are the dynamics of that? What are the drivers of that? What are the numbers associated with that? So central to that is this question of livelihoods. And how do people make it their living? How dependent are they on ecosystems, or on how will the climate impacts affect the economies on which they are dependent? And so we're really fortunate that we're able to not just weave that into the work we're doing at the research level and begin to tie that more systematically into how we think about these things at the country level, but that we can bring these experts who are supporting this work to share some of their ideas, some of their insights and experiences with us today. So I'm really grateful that we have a series of speakers outside of the bank and then colleagues within the bank who are helping us out today. So I don't know if everybody has anybody seen the outline, how we're going to proceed? Do I need to read this? I guess I'll read it. So first we're going to hear from Brent McCusker, who's going to talk about livelihood analysis and mapping in Ethiopia. And then we'll hear from Carlo Del Nino on social protection mechanisms and good practices in the Sahel. We'll have some discussants, both from inside and outside of the bank. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. Again, this is part of the longer-term PPCR learning series. So, this is being added to our online presence. I think we have a portal where you can see the recordings or minutes from some of these sessions. So I encourage you to go there. But thank you again to everybody for joining us. And let's start off with Brent, who is a professor from the Associate Professor of Geography at West Virginia University. Has done a lot of research on land use and livelihood systems in sub-Saharan Africa. He's currently looking on the impacts of climate on rural livelihoods and economic development in Malawi, and working with different institutions, including USAID, on vulnerability analysis and mapping across sub-Saharan Africa. So we're very grateful that you can join us. Before we jump in, I guess I should probably just check in. So we do have people who have dialed in, and we will make sure that we try and include you in the conversation. But before we get going, I would ask that everybody mute, or that we set the master mute in place so that we don't get a lot of background noise during the presentation. But Brent, please take it away. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, and thanks for having me here today. There's, I think, great overlap between what some of the work that we've been doing and what the World Bank Group is doing, so it's good to share these sorts of issues and findings. So just to begin, I'm going to speak today specifically on a research project that we call Livelihoods Analysis and Mapping. I'm going to focus on Ethiopia. So the Livelihoods Analysis and Mapping program is one that we were asked by USAID specifically to do to help them with focus and selectivity of their development intervention programs. We've conducted livelihoods analysis and mapping in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh, in Malawi, and we are just getting ready to conclude the study for Rwanda, and Mozambique is on the next country that is up for analysis after we finished Rwanda. So these are customized analyses. These are not driven by research questions. They are driven by USAID mission staff in the countries in which we work, who have specific development programming needs. So this is a bit different from a typical research presentation where we say, what is the effect of climate change on X? I've done those specifically in Malawi, several of those, but this is a bit different. So the questions and the way that we cover this may seem to be a bit different, and that's largely why. So I work with a unit in USAID called the Geo Center, which is dedicated to spreading geographic thinking throughout the agency. The idea being that will help with better programming throughout the agency. We map household exposure to multiple shocks within countries, and then we try to determine the factors that correlate to whether or not a household was exposed to each shock. Both of these activities are, and were when we started this, very, very new for USAID staff. They had not particularly explored geographic dimensions of the context in which they were programming, or how their programming could be done geographically, or the impact geographically of their analyses. And Ethiopia is a very good case study because we were actually able to use this analysis to show some impact of Feed the Future program, which is a large USG-wide food security program. We then take the results of these studies and we align them to mission programming and/or planning. So, for instance, in Uganda, there is a country development. Every USAID mission present country has a country development and cooperation strategy, which is the 5-year overarching framework agreement between the country and the U.S. government for investment priorities. And so, in Uganda, we actually affected that CDCS to change the way that it looks at programming from a district or regional basis, working on district by district, to moving to corridors of development, because we were able to use household level survey data and show some interesting patterns that they hadn't seen before. And we did the same type of analysis for Ethiopia. So what did we do? We used for Ethiopia, we used data from the 2011-12 and 13-14 Living Standards Measurement Study. Thank you very much. We love those. We want more of those. Any advocacy we can do to get more of those, we will do. They are really fine and wonderful data sets for us to use. We like exploring the various dimensions of them. Mission staff are particularly interested in shocks. So in this sort of planning environment, there is an assumption that the environment's not going to change. So that's a very dangerous assumption. And I mean physical environment won't change. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, well, what does your development programming look like if there is a shock? And the mission GIS specialists, some of our overseas missions have GIS officers, started to think about that, and then they thought this is something that we need to explore. There are a common set of shocks in the LSMS modules. We look at those. We determine which shocks were most widespread for the years that we were using, panel data, not cross-sectional. And so we then explore those dominant shocks, whatever they may be. So for 2011-12 and 13-14, we mapped the shocks, the price shocks, which was the largest shock in Ethiopia, not natural hazards. This year, if we had we do have a survey for this year that's being finalized, and it probably will, natural hazards would probably take over price shock, although it surprised us in other locations. But price shocks, food price, agricultural inputs, etc., natural hazards, flood, drought, landslide, and fire, and health, illness or death of a family member, birth of a household. Health, a great deal of USAID's programming is health-related. It's the safest thing to get through Congress, and it has been for a long time. And so they do a lot of health programming. The health offices generally don't see a lot of connections between what they do and what the environment offices or the economic growth offices do. And so this helped to really make a case for cross-sectoral analysis of programs because of the interrelatedness of the shocks. The sample size was just under 4,000 households, representative at region, as you see there, for those lead regions, and then all other regions as a unit. We then conducted regression analysis, spatial regression analysis, a spatial filter model, geographically weighted regressions, and cluster analyses that you'll see in the upcoming maps. And we did that because this was new to USAID. We did not want to make maps that you often see where there is a great deal of uncertainty, but there is a shade given to the map because people don't understand blank or white spaces on maps. And so instead of arbitrarily filling those in, we wanted to be very, very careful because we knew programming decisions might be made from these. So what did we find? We found that in at least the 13 and 14, price shocks were most prevalent, and they were widespread. Natural hazards were widespread in 2011 and 12, but not at a crisis level, I would say, as in this past year in Ethiopia, which is undergoing a significant crisis. All three shocks decreased in those time periods. Better educated households are associated with lower levels of vulnerability. Better educated females are associated with lower levels of vulnerability, and land poor households are associated with more vulnerability. So those are storylines and messages that were not shocking, no pun intended. That's not surprising. But what we were able to do is to show on maps, and I've only picked out a select few. I've given you probably 5% of all of the analysis we did, so we can go into detail if there are questions. But we picked out the associations that mission staff were interested in. And I'll show you those in these maps coming up just now. So this is what our household shock map looks like. We aggregate all of the shocks that households suffered or were exposed to by year. Why did we choose 2014 and make it larger and emphasize it? That's just simply because the USAID mission staff wanted the most recent data. In some countries, they ask us for the biggest shock because they're interested the year with the biggest shock. So in Uganda, they wanted us to emphasize that year rather than the most recent. It's just an arbitrary choice in most cases to just get the latest information. And you can see the distribution of all of the shocks that households reported experiencing. This is a bit different than what we normally see with vulnerability studies, where this is not an analysis of variables that could lead households to be vulnerable. It is the reporting of the household themselves and the degree to which, because they actually say severe or not severe. There's a measurement of this. So this is actually the reporting of the households themselves as to their exposure to the shock, which is a bit different. I think it's complementary to climate vulnerability mapping. Because we know that vulnerability is highly differentiated within communities and within regions, and so this is one snapshot of that. Now, how do we get that smooth surface? We use interpolation techniques to smooth the surface between the household data points. We do that with a filter that is relevant to the country itself, so we don't use a standard smoothing surface for every country. We go into the literature and investigate things like distance to market, distance to health clinics, distance to schools, to see what is a reasonable surface that we can create. But we do leave white or blank places on our maps, and that's a challenge for us as we present these. But we'd rather not present where we're not statistically confident. And so what you're seeing there, what is shaded, is statistically significant. It is not just a mapped variable. And so what we're asked to do, and one of the products that mission staff themselves like quite more than we expected them to like it, is this heat map, or this waffle graph, where we break down the exposure of households by region. So you can compare, for instance, Somali region there on the extreme left was 30% greater than the average in price shocks and hazard shocks, but was slightly under in health shocks. And then that allows for disaggregation. It also allows you to see what the relative balance between shocks in certain areas are, if you're not someone who's particularly keen of maps. We go and we look at the various dimensions. Sorry, this is a bit small down in that corner on this projector, where we look at the households. That's an age distribution, so we look at the percentage of households reporting the shock, price shock, health shock, and hazard shock by age. Age was a particular question that was we were asked to analyze. We looked at coping mechanisms, which we often do, because there's a very nice coping module in most of the LSMS data sets. We look at whether they are asset depleting, whether they are asset protecting. In Bangladesh, which I presented on last week, we actually were able to determine at what shock level, income-wise, or the expense of the shock, I should say, how expensive a shock is. Does it move a household into no coping, good strategies which are not asset depleting, or what we call bad strategies which do deplete assets? And we looked and we found that between 20,000 and 34,000 taka in Bangladesh, households move from coping mechanisms that do not deplete assets to ones that do. And that's very precise information for our staff as they say, how bad does this health issue have to be, and where are we having those health issues in particular? And we did that for Ethiopia. I just didn't put it on these series of slides. So price shocks were widespread, and you can see the distribution in 2012 and 2014. in those areas in the east and the south. Dirdawa, in particular, had acute price shocks. And again, this is, I think if we said this or we put this in a table form, it's not completely surprising to anyone. But what we are able to do is map what contributed to the households having those shocks. So for instance, in plate 2, you see there married head of households in the areas marked in brown. Those households with married heads have more shocks. In blue areas, they have fewer shocks. That's something that we found quite surprises mission staff, that normally it's something like female head of household is always more vulnerable. Well, in many countries that we've done this analysis, we found that in some areas, female-headed households are less vulnerable, either to all shocks or specific shocks. But in other parts of the country, they're more vulnerable. Well, that changes a programming calculus quite significantly, not to make a blanket assumption that everywhere, all of whatever socio-demographic issue you're looking at, it's not the same across the country. And that's where we've had some specific insights. Female education. And again, we've been probably too conservative on our maps because we were very careful to cut off at the 95th percentile. We didn't want to go down to 90. Many mission staff ask us to go that way because we get a more colorful map with more information. And we do upon request, and we have sent back. But these are very careful maps. And then wealth or asset ownership. There are more contributing factors to price shocks. These are just the three that we selected based on mission interest. And then we're able to say, for instance, in panel 3 there, well, what is the exact effect of education? So households with higher female education report fewer price shocks. So that by the time you're to tertiary education, households with females that have tertiary education are 10% less likely to report a price shock. And mission staff said, well, that's great, but how many rural Ethiopian women have tertiary education? We said not many. However, if you're looking for interventions with impact, you know the relative difference between targeting certain groups of individuals versus others. And we can look through our data and find similar patterns. Oh, sorry. I think that I did that wrong. Yeah. So we did the same with hazard shocks, where we look at the distribution of households reporting natural hazards. Again, just for clarification, the darker red color mean that there were more households reporting severe shocks, natural hazards. In this instance, it would be drought. Drought was driving both 2012. But you see, drought is significant in the south in 2012, but moves more to the northeast and in 2014. What we're trying to convey, and we can animate these, and we have in the past, is that there's such geographic variation. USAID has what it calls focus districts, priority districts, where they just take a district, literally a district of the country, to focus their investment. And we said this might be need to be a little bit more sensitive to time and geography. And again, the contributing factors, which we can go through. I'm trying to stay within my time. And so what we often do is we assess the performance. We're asked to assess the performance of a specific program or policy. And we were asked to see if there was no hope when we started this that we would actually be able to get an answer, because they've never been able to get an answer out of this. But Ethiopia is a high presence country for Feed the Future programming, $500 million in the last 10 years, which is more than most countries combined. And so they wanted to know, can we measure an impact? And we said, we can measure an impact. And we did, because we're able to isolate the effect of geography. The green zones are Feed the Future zones. We had enough households, just through block, we had enough households both in and outside of the zones. So we isolated the effect of geography. And we were able to say households worry less about having enough food in Feed the Future zones. Between 2012 and 14, there was a significant improvement. They eat fewer undesirable foods inside the zones. They have fewer months with food shortages. And they have significant measurable decreases in health problems. So they have fewer health shocks as a result of being. Everything else is isolated. We control for all of the other household size, number of children. It doesn't just rain in Feed the Future zones. That was one of our, it rains all over or it doesn't rain all over. because the zones were picked to be heterogeneous geographically. We know the decay effect of that. This was pretty surprising that we could actually get some indication, and we can't attribute this. We don't know which programs within Feed the Future or DFID or bank aligned programming. We don't have that level of information, but we can say that in those zones, people are doing better than outside of those zones. And I just wanted to conclude with a few thoughts and questions about migration and climate, and some things that we know, and some just ideas about Ethiopia particularly. We know that out-migration is a last-choice coping mechanism, and so if we're seeing out-migration under climate change, we know that it's gotten quite bad. It is not a last choice in terms of livelihood strategies, however. It's often a first choice for men to go to the cities or to a neighboring area for employment. But in terms of coping, we know that it is an indicator of a pretty severe issue. Given the aridity and instability of most of Ethiopia's neighbors, we could expect, the word could, we could expect in migration, if we're talking about international migration, to be a key issue. We know from Malawi, where we tested one of the assumptions of the IPCC, which is that there would be large rural to urban migration. We know that that does not always hold. In Malawi, our households, this is a different data set of about 2,500 households that we interviewed, less than 10% would move to the next largest city under scenarios of pretty severe climate change, and we talked through what that meant at the household level. So there's some question about intra-rural and rural-urban migration. We know it's prompted also by economic change, which gives us some entangling effects that we'd have to account for. And so what we've learned and from these studies and others is it's going to be very important to keep in mind the interactions between climate-induced and economic-induced change. The double exposure thesis is particularly difficult without focused surveys and focused work to disentangle that. At a broad scale, it probably isn't as big of an issue as if we're trying to make district-level policy in some of our developing countries. So that's the very, very broad outline of our contribution in Ethiopia. I have many more slides and happy to discuss and take questions.
Great. Thank you, Brent. We'll move on to the next speaker, but just so people are very clear, these kinds of conclusions are relevant both for the way we're conducting the analysis, so that this notion that people may or may not move to a city in country. One of the questions is, how long do they move? Do they go back home at some point? Because part of the purpose of the research is to come up with policy solutions that governments can or might consider. And so we need to take these issues into account of, are these permanent changes, or are these things that these are temporary and we need different kinds of fixes for that? From the modeling perspective, your last point is really key, because it's this disentangling of two key dynamics. And what we're really trying to do with the research is see if we can tease out the climate signal as a primary driver, isolating it from some of the other important factors that might exist. So the role of researchers who have experience on the ground is just very helpful to what we're trying to do with the overall report. So thank you very much. Carlo Del Nino is the lead economist for the social protection and labor global practice at the bank. And he will be talking about research that he's been involved in, or work that he's been involved in, looking at the Sahel. So Carlo, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I know that one of the subject matters it is migration. I didn't make any specific reference. Maybe here and there I may say a couple of things or two about migration. I didn't give huge thought, but I do try to spend quite a bit of time talking about livelihoods, and this is something which I think it's a very important issue. I think the starting point, everybody agrees with the starting point, but how much climate change is having an impact on the frequency, intensity of extreme weather patterns and shocks. Now, from our perspective, from a social perspective, social protection perspective, we try to understand to what extent these type of shocks have a larger impact on which kind of populations are they having larger impact on the poor, and which kind of things can these programs do in order to help them. So the link between disaster and poverty, I think, has been fairly well established. You know, there is the wonderful work done on the shock waves, I think, grounds these assumptions. But also there is another important issue that not only disasters affect more disproportionately people which are poor, but also prevents people that are poor from not becoming poor. So what is going to be the pathways of moving people out of poverty? And this is something that we're very much interested in. And this is, if you take the case that I mentioned here of what is happening in the southern cone, of Africa, you see that there is a community, there is a common concerns, which is very, very up to date. So one of the things we point out is the fact that, if you do not have a good social protection mechanism, the only response mechanism you can have to these type of shocks, which are maybe most of them, they're going to be more frequent because of the climate impact, there's going to be just humanitarian response. If you look at that, they kind of follow a little bit some specific patterns, and there are some countries which are much more which receive much more aid than other countries. But I mean, the key question is that an alternative from a social protection point of view to this type of response? On the other hand, we also want to look at what happens to the households. I mean, households, they cope and adapt in some ways. They use a variety of strategy, which is, income diversifications, asset accumulation. But, in doing that, for example, maybe some seasonal migration could be also one of the ways in which a poor household may cope, especially in some agrarian societies where you have a very determined production patterns. But, even, if the households are able to use this coping mechanism, there are large welfare costs to the risk of the shocks that, they remain. And there's been some work which has shown that, even 10 years after droughts, there are some impact, for example, on nutritional status of the children, which are long-term, which are very long-term. And the other one is also there are some choices that households do before any shock occurs that also may reduce the capacity of households to become no poor. For example, some production choices that households do, which are much less risky, they, using, old varieties of agriculture productions and staple commodities. Now, if you look at the role of social protection, we know that there has been a large impact on poverty decline. The case of Rwanda. When you have existing programs, and then they do have some kind of a shock comes, that you have the people which are covered do fare much better than people which are not covered, like the case in northern Kenya. And when you do not have the programs like people which are not covered in Ethiopia, there are very large long-term impacts. So we know that there is a basic there. But, the key question is that, we know that there is this instrument which is working very well. Which other things we can do, we can add to these basic social protection systems and instruments to make them more effective to respond to the needs of climate change, to respond to the needs of these additional issues. So what we look at, when we talk about adaptive social protection, we're talking about an integrated approach that can take into account both the challenge of adaptation, what households do in response to climate risk, and on the other side, try to improve the management and the response to the shocks. We're talking about flexible programs, and we're looking at basically which kind of things can be done before something occurs and something can be done after something occurs. This is the key things. So when you're looking about these systems, we're not talking about just one single program that has been managed in one single country. But we're talking about more or less the systems, which are policies, the programs that can support these vulnerable households. On one hand, you want to look at the ways how to increase the resilience over long term, and this can be done through a combination of social protection with other development programs, like agricultural development, for example, that provide better production options. You can be doing, with some other programs can help investments in productive assets, facilitating access to basic access, to basic services, like, for example, we were talking before, if you do have an impact on nutritional status of the children, if they, have access to basic services, they can take care of those. And the other one is the scaling up. Now, one of the things that we're doing that I'm involved with is this adaptive social protection program in the Sahel. This is a program which started in 2014. This is a program that is being financed by a multi-donor trust fund, which a lot of support from the British government. And this is the objective of these programs in the Sahel countries, which covers Mauritania, Chad, Senegal, Burkina, Mali, and Niger. And so this is a program that is trying to help countries to get these programs started and coordinated and better managed. This is complemented by other IDA-funded programs on the tune of over $250 million over a period of 3 to 5 years. Now, when we're looking at the first bucket, is improving household resilience. So how do we expect to do that? So, by providing some basic transfers to the participants into these programs, help them to build the human capital, and then the other key things is they're supporting better livelihoods, and that's we go back to the issues of what households can really do, and we look at two different aspects. One is the intensifications and diversification. Intensification means can we help them do better to what they're already doing, and diversification, is it important for them to diversify their activities? Once again, look at the some of in the Sahel. You have a lot of seasonal crops that they're carried out, and if you're relying only on growing millet and sorghum in a lot of these countries, once you have a drought, your production is going to drop. And if there isn't anything else that you do during the wintertime, that's the first opening that you have to that seasonal migration I mentioned before, or some kind of negative COVID mechanisms, which have been mentioned before as well. Very quickly, the link between ASP and early childhood development, I think is very important because it's one of the aspects in which we really look at how can these programs can be linked to developing the human capital of the households and of the children. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but focusing more on this livelihood support. So there is a lot of evidence now that providing short-term cash transfer is something which is very beneficial. You can have a large impact, but we don't know what happens really in the longer term. So the key question we're asking ourselves in the management of these programs: to what extent livelihood support can help households to deal with risk beyond the short term? I mean, can we really have a longer-term impact on these programs? So what we're launching now in the Sahel, we are launching this program in which we're starting from, this BRAC experiment of the graduation package. Can we develop some kind of evidence how we can address the main constraints of these households and help to engage in some productive activities, improve what they're doing, or doing some other things? The package which we envision has a certain key element. The first element is the community sensitization or aspirational social norms, trying to help these groups of beneficiaries that participate into this program understand what are the things they could do and could not do. And, talking about this, once again, there could be some reference made to the different strategy, different part of the year. And that could also include the other one, which we mentioned before, about the migration. The other one is saving groups. Having access to savings, especially for very poor people, is a key issue. The other one is life skills, and which kind of training can be done that can help these people to do better what they're doing or doing other things. And also, they will need some help in planning. Sometimes microfinance institutions do that. If they bring people in, they want to know actually what they're going to do with this money, which kind of plannings do they have. And the other one is access to a crash grant. So the idea is that during the period that people participating to these programs, they will have access to basic transfers, and in addition to these basic transfers, they can also have access to credit and a lump sum. And the other one is access to market. Trying to facilitate this access to market, which could imply both managing better the flow of inputs or trying to find out some access for other things that might be interested to produce. And the last one is coaching and follow-up. So what we're doing, these are key questions we're doing right now. Is an experiment which are be conducted in all 6 countries, and we'll keep you posted about what we learn and what works, what doesn't work. So there is not one key axis. There are a lot of moving parts. How much is the diversification versus intensification? How much important is the cash grant? How much important is the training mechanism? The other element, which also I'm going to mention very briefly, is also this issue of the scaling up. Scaling up to respond to shocks is very important. One of the things that we talk a lot about, in this environment is that, if you have a drought, or if you identify some areas which are more vulnerable, on using some early warning systems that you have, a lot of times one of the instruments that we use in social protection is cash for work programs. Food, it used to be food for work programs, and one of the things we do, we try to promote those in the period of the year where the agriculture season is slower. Like, for example, in the Sahel, you have a production system where you have the planting takes place after the rainy season, June, July, and the harvest comes around November and December. So now it comes, January, February, people are idle. In order to keep people in place, in order to be able to give them some kind of possible revenue, having these programs and knowing that these programs are going to be there helps them a lot. Now, in order to be able to have a successful program that can respond to shocks, you really want to have systems which are flexible and scalable. You need to be able to extend the coverage of the existing programs, or having some kind of programs can be scaled up effectively. And you want to make sure that you have some instruments that allow a much faster response than you would have with humanitarian aid. Now, you want to be able also to have a certain footprint. If you have a very small program, it's not going to, it's going to be very hard. It's going to take a long time to do it. You need to have a good information system that allows you to know what are the trigger mechanisms, at what level of a drought. So it leaks a lot. What you were saying before. You can have a static situation in which you have some program that exists. But if this situation is dynamic and you say, oh, look, we know from an early warning system that this area is more effective, then a program like Feed the People can really be match that and then complement what we are doing. And having some financial instruments and resources available ex ante is also something which is very important. In terms of cost, these are not programs that don't cost very much. Of course, everybody says that, when they promote their own program, but they're only asking about 1% to 2% of GDP, knowing that, sometimes universal programs can cover between 3, 4, or 5% of the GDP. So instead of, having some different kinds of programs. And we saw that, that from the Dryland report, which was published very recently, we did an analysis and we did some kind of simulation. We saw that, some different kinds of scenarios, you can cover 25% of, over 100 million vulnerable people in 2030 with 0.3% of the GDP. And we did some simulation. If you also have a more serious drought, you can go up to 1%. But this one costs a lot less than the humanitarian aid. This is a little bit of the simulation that this graphic shows a little bit the simulation of the cost, how much it would cost to cover the vulnerable population in 2030 under the different scenarios. Of course, there are some outliers, like Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, countries where you have much more susceptible to these type of programs. But, at the end of the day, having something in place is going to cost much less. Not all is going to cost much less, but allows you to program ahead which kind of things you want to do, and you can have a long-lasting impact on the lives of these people. And I think then you can also think about interlink this with what you were talking about before. Then what is going to be the role of migration? Are people going to be more or less interested to move from one area to another area? Are you going to be able to prevent people from using seasonal migration as a coping mechanism, or is something that you want to encourage? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carlo.
I think it was last time that was mentioned to me before.
Yeah, you're right on time. So thank you very much for that. It's great to hear, because I think I mentioned one of the last parts of the research is going to focus on, okay, here's what we think, some of the issues might be. Here are what we think it might be in terms of actual numbers. But the last part of the report is, and here's what we can or should be doing about it. One of the interesting things, I think, is dealing with some of the investments that you're talking about in the face of, the scientific uncertainty. And, how do we make decisions in terms of what kind of social protection systems or programs we put into place when we really don't know if this drought is the new normal or if it's a 2-year situation that we need to be dealing with, because those are going to require some very different options that we consider. So it would be great to have a follow-up conversation about how we do take uncertainty into account when we're doing some of the planning work from there. But thank you very much.
And we found that participation in PSNP in Ethiopia lowered vulnerability, was associated with lower vulnerability to shocks. And in Malawi, the number one coping mechanism households anticipate using to buffer against climate shocks, village savings and loans. Mm-hmm. So we have evidence that those are actually hypothetical or derived.
Yeah, and that links neatly back to some of the previous research that we've been doing, shockwaves and things like that. So,
but the key things, if I can just add one thing, is that to what extent an old-fashioned social protection program using these additional measures and links to other development programs can have a large impact. Right. Sometimes people say, oh no, we have been doing village savings loans for 20 years.
You have to give it a new shiny name.
But it's not the type. I mean, if you do give the opportunities to participate to a program for a certain period of time, then you can release some of the stress that they have in order to be able to produce during that time. I think it's the combination of the two programs together that may have a much larger impact of using those two separately. I think this is my...
Yeah. One of the things when I hear these conversations, we have another major report that's coming out in 2017, and it's called the Carbon Wealth of Nations research or report, and it focuses on the economic impacts in fossil fuel intensive countries of changing global climate policy regimes. And, when you think about the changing social protection schemes or economic diversification that folks are going to have to pursue, possibly in light of a changing, global policy regime, doesn't sound that dissimilar from what I'm hearing you're saying you need to think about on the ground in terms of safety nets, et cetera, when we're talking about the impacts of climate change, not the policies per se, but the actual physical impacts of climate change. So, I think one of the things that we're going to want to be teasing out over the course of this year is how these different research projects lend themselves towards solutions that are common, and where we might see differences that would be important when we're out dealing with clients on the ground. So enough of me. You want to hear from some of our other experts in the room. Alex Desherbanen and Vera Vemuru are here to respond to some of what they've heard. Vera is a senior social development specialist with the World Bank, based in the global practice, the Social Urban Rural Resilience, GSUR global practice. And then Alex is Associate Director for Science Applications at CSIN, which is a scientific research institute based at Columbia University up in New York. CSIN is helping out quite a bit with some of the analysis and underlying analytic work for the migration study. So I'm pleased that both of you could join us today. But who'd like to go first?
I can go first.
Okay.
Okay. This is fascinating. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a fascinating discussion. I'm coming to the conversation from the point of forced displacement and mixed migration because I'm leading some projects in the Horn of Africa on these issues. So we experienced climate-induced change at two levels. One was in terms of what was ultimately, I mean, even when countries were affected by conflict, what was the driver that led to people moving? And Somalia is a classic case where 2011, 2012 saw a huge exodus into Kenya, into Somalia, into Ethiopia and Somalia, into that region. And we're again seeing that phenomenon playing out into 2016 drought, and there's also a current drought, and then we are seeing both migration across boundaries, but also internally. There's a huge internal displacement that's happening into those few safe areas. So you can imagine what's happening to those governments even in trying to cope with any. So that's one part of the problem that we're looking at. The second part of the problem we're looking at is so many of these refugees are hosted in areas almost next to international boundaries, which themselves are extremely vulnerable, both from an environmental perspective, but have huge development deficits. So this large number of large additional population in these highly fragile environments are again leading to degradation, complete loss of biomass. One of the hallmark of a refugee camp is you stand there and you can't see a tree for miles because it's all gone, and most of this displacement is protracted. So it has, so that's one impact. And most of these areas, I don't know how it is, have all seen droughts, right? I mean, have been successive droughts. So what's happened is, one, there is this additional pressure, but their own capacity of resilience is completely gone. So what you see is terrible stuff, right? I just want to reflect on a couple of countries. So just to give a context, Djibouti, for instance, has huge Somali refugees. If you went to the Aliade refugee camp, both within the camp and outside, you would not see anybody between the age of 16 to 40. They're all gone. The refugees tell that the host communities were much better off, and these successive droughts have made it so bad that they told them, please help them. They're like so much worse than us. We feel bad, right? I mean, that's the situation we're dealing with. So, and also the other impacts of this, what we're seeing on the host communities is that there's been, and most of these are agro-pastoral areas, there's been a clear change in the livestock composition. Most of the cattle are gone. It's goats and camel. And even if they do hold on to some cattle, they're grazed in 100 kilometers away. So that's also anecdotal evidence, at least for us, is it's changing nutritional levels at households. Kids, you have more and more kids who are malnourished and a lot of diseases because they just kind of fall sick. And the second part is the whole women's role, right? I mean, women are becoming now the providers or in charge. In a culture background where gender roles are still, or the relations are where it is pretty patriarchal, so women are fighting this thing about the need to provide, but then a system that pushes back. And also what the cattle provided them was an opportunity of an interaction at a public place. I mean, they sold milk, and so that's gone. So you have these social changes that are happening, which in some ways we all can relate it back to climate-induced change, because that's what's changed everything. So I want to tie this up with the social protection. So what we are trying to do is, as part of the interventions, is to actually do something with the environment. And we're using labor-intensive public works as a transitional mechanism, both for youth and women, to kind of get incomes to tide over, but then also help invest in assets and skills and other things, so that you kind of increase the resilience and coping, right? And so it's about soil conservation, water management, water pan, just for so that the idea is that you, to the extent possible, can recreate some of the pastoral livelihoods. You're also looking at possibilities of making agriculture more predictable, at least with whatever little water you can. But then at the same time, investing much more on assets and skills so that they also can tide over the difficult times. So I just wanted to, through this intervention, to pull together, these two presentations that were made, is that one issue I would like to put on the table is, we do talk about coping mechanisms and migration, out-migration not being a first response. But then if we disaggregate by age, how does this really change? I mean, and often I've seen women and the old and the children left behind and everybody else is gone. So, and that has huge impacts. And just one last point I wanted to make was this early warning mechanisms are critical because, when you look at Somalia dealing with 500,000 people moving into a small area, at least, at some point of time, this kind of information probably would help some of these governments, especially the regional, even in Ethiopia, for instance, the regional governments are pretty weak in some of these areas. Can they use this information to be better prepared for some of these durable solutions that unfortunately are becoming, these problems are becoming almost recurrent. And so can they be better prepared to actually address these issues?
Great. Thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Steve. Both presentations were really full of lots of really interesting information. Our role in the report will be to develop some plausible future scenarios of migration based on climate impacts from intersectoral impact models. So we'll be looking at crop production and water availability, and we'll also include sea level rise in coastal areas. So, if these programs are successful that Carlo and Brent have described, I think that one of the real issues will be, are we going to see the kinds of migration that we might otherwise expect actually occur? I mean, can people actually adapt in situ? And I think that's the big $64,000 question right now is, will people be able to actually adapt in some of these locations given prolonged drought or other impacts? In answer to Steve's question, one of the things we may be able to provide a partial answer to is whether these are likely to be short-term kind of shocks versus potentially longer-term prolonged situations. And so we're working very closely with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research to look at where these sectoral impacts are going to be greatest over the next 40 years. I think Brent's work is fantastic because it really assists in the geographic targeting, very specific targeting of assistance packages. And I think some of the types of activities that Carlo describes are laudable, but having traveled in many rural parts of the developing world, I also know the challenges of delivering services in these really isolated, often population sparsely settled and remote areas. We're working currently in Sierra Leone on some climate vulnerability assessment in the coastal zone. And in theory, they're well connected because they're right on the coast, but these are very isolated villages. I think one of the interesting aspects of Brent's work is the self-reported nature of the climate shocks or the natural hazards, the health and the food. One of the things we found in Sierra Leone is actually people have become so used in this coastal zone where they're living literally at sea level. In fact, during the rainy season, the water is lapping at their doorstep, if not actually at some depth in their compound. That they don't even consider climate impacts a significant or important factor because they're just used to the fact that every year they get this massive inundation, and it's part of their kind of it's become part of their life, and in some senses they have adapted in various ways to that. So it would be interesting to complement some of the self-reported information with actual climate data. I find it, especially where the climate change narrative has become so embedded in many parts of the world that people automatically say, well, it's climate or it's El Nino or whatever. It's actually interesting to see whether the self-reported information actually jibes with what's observed through the climate data. Lastly, I just wanted to add maybe another area to the mix of things that Carlo mentioned, and I'm not sure. There were so many slides and so many bullets, I may have missed it. Some of the literature I'm reading currently on the issues of climate resilience are the importance of social connections and whether households are isolated and whether they're plugged in not only to the village savings networks, but are they part of a community association or a mosque or a church or something else that can provide them with some additional connections. And as we see more migration and displacement in the future, what's going to happen to those social networks? And is there any proactive mechanism that we can take from a policy perspective to actually promote greater inclusion? I know that in Vietnam and the Mekong, the reported information was that you move someone even 2 kilometers out of their village or where they were originally, and all those connections of dependence to the landlords or to other people in their village can be broken. And so how can we promote greater social capital in the future? So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes left, and why don't we just open it up for questions. If folks are online and we send out a request for you to send your questions to us electronically.
They can also ask them verbally if they want.
Well, it gets a little chaotic if we do that. So if you can send your questions via we're using WebEx, I guess?
WebEx chat, yeah.
Please do so. Otherwise, any questions here from folks in the room?
It's not really a question, but it's just an addition to this discussion.
Can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Yuka Makina. I work in the South Asia Disaster Management and Climate Change Unit. And just in addition, because I didn't realize today's discussion would involve social protection, but in about a week or two, we're just setting up for review a handbook that we've created of how to integrate disaster risk management and social protection. And that's, since it's from a disaster management perspective, we divide it into slow onset like drought, and then rapid onset like earthquakes and landslides, things like that. We've divided the handbook into before, during, and after, and recovery, so that what kind of social protection tools can be used or modified, like you were saying, adaptive social protection, modified to adapt to the disaster situation. So that might be of interest to people in this group because it's just coming in. We had a launch in Japan in December, last month, and so we're going to be reviewing it and it'll be published soon. So.
Great. Thank you for that. Any other? Yes, please.
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Ibrahimi, and I'm insurance specialist over at IFC's Gender Secretariat. And last June, I believe it was, I had the pleasure of participating in the Feed the Future roundtable program on resilience to help them evaluate their programming and kind of get some new input looking forward. And one of the main areas of debate, actually, amongst the participants was at what level should we be intervening? Is it at the household level? As Brent's work showed that there are certain household level factors which do have a great impact on whether certain interventions are effective or not, or should it be more at a community level or a regional level, such as Carlo's work suggests. So I was just wondering any input or feedback on how your research might be able to help contribute to this debate of where should we be intervening.
I can give you some examples from some of the field work. The greater the scale, the more likelihood there are leakages in the system, meaning that in Malawi, there's a huge debate over the fertilizer input subsidy program. And we know that at anything above the village level, the traditional leadership will hoard coupons, and then villagers don't get them or get them 6 months late. So that is a balance. It's a cost to intervene at the household. It's a tremendous cost. especially in countries where the population density is not high. And so it's sort of a trade-off that has to be evaluated between the ability to reach people might be better at a greater scale at the community or the regional scale, might be the only way, but we have to accept that there will be some leakages and some loss. And we know that people don't that donors and donors' constituents do not accept any loss as acceptable. Any reporting of the normal sort of problems that we have just comes back to really undermine programs. So there's not a perfect answer, unfortunately, for that. I mean, it's going to be a series of trade-offs from our experience and the research we've conducted.
It was precisely surrounding and even going all the way up to kind of really regional facilities, looking at ARC, for example. Even that had some criticism as not being the one and only blanket solution.
Because, we're expected to design the perfect development project, not good enough. But it has to be perfect, with no flaws, the first time. No iterations the first time. And it's a real challenge. It's a great question.
So now there.
Yes.
Can people speak loudly, please, so that
They can hear it online.
Exactly.
Svetlana Ingruster, I'm with the Climate Investment Fund. For your presentation about Ethiopia and beyond, when you were talking about health and the impacts, and the relationships with health outcomes, was that coming from the Living Standards Survey, or were DHS data used at all? Because I know that, well, I come from DHS background as well, but I know that all the countries that you mentioned, and I know that Feed the Future works in a lot of countries where DHS surveys have been conducted, so the health information, and they also do GIS, data collection as part of it. So have you mapped that, or?
Well, I chose LSMS because this is the World Bank.
No, of course, that, yes.
So many of those come out of our regression results, so we find that interaction. However, we do use DHS. That is a huge, USAID funds a great deal of DHS. We weren't getting a lot of mission requests for it because the health offices tend to have their own information specialists who do things the health way. However, in Rwanda, we are using DHS. Niger, which was another country, I don't know if I mentioned that we did this work, they want us to use some surveys as well that are DHS or DHS-like. So yes, we do use them. I just don't have them here. I can show you some examples of Rwanda where we did that. We use whatever helps us better understand the question. Oftentimes we use them together.
Yes. Tom.
Yeah, I have a question, and this is about
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Tampi Matambo, and anyways, I'm in the climate analytics and advisory service. So my question is, you talked about when you were doing your study, you mentioned a little bit about how the health people don't talk to climate people and the environment people, and how has your work managed to sort of help the institutions start looking at these things in terms of climate change? Like, how does this help make the institution itself and the people who are working in these different departments work together? Has that helped or not?
It's been one of our biggest surprises, and we work more on the communication of this information at this point than we are working on actually generating new country studies, because it has resulted, and I'll give you a very brief example. In Bangladesh, the Feed the Future zone is in the southwest around Khulna and the Sundarbans, and the health office was focused there because that's where they were focusing, but we found some relationships between stunting and more resilient and more robust livelihoods in Sylhet. And the health office couldn't figure out what was going on. And so they then go and talk to the environment officers. They went and said, is this a wash, water, hygiene, sanitation? Is this what could possibly be causing this correlation of high food consumption scores? Very high, the highest food consumption scores in the country, and the highest prevalence of stunting. And so in those instances, in most of the missions that we've worked, we have had these cross-cutting dynamic discussions that emerge because I don't know if it's the map, I don't know if it's because we're really trying to be succinct and we don't go into huge amounts of explanation of the methods, and so we try to get those interesting cross-cutting issues. But I think it's the map, because they see together that this health shock has a direct relationship to female education, which education and health teams know this. They just don't get pretty maps all the time demonstrating statistically that that's the case. And so I think it's the combination of it's visually appealing, it's easy to understand, and you can say, this isn't just mapping two variables, these are statistically related, right? We can be very, very confident, which, you know, when you're trying to argue in front of Congress that your program is necessary, that's what you want. You want scientists said, you know, that. So it has, we have seen it. We have seen it. We have little, you know, we have to always promote everything internally over and over and over again. So we have these little micro narratives on our USAID internal site that say how we affected this in Uganda. Uganda switched from districts to corridors, and their health team now. So yes, we have seen it, but it's a long process. Yeah. It's not always successful. There are failures along the way. We'd like to have more success in some of the countries that are obvious candidates. I won't mention them. And we just don't go anywhere. And in other places, we do hit it because we've hit a really key issue. The most important thing is we listen first. We go in and do a needs assessment and let the mission staff tell us what they need, and then we try to answer those questions.
Anybody else in the room?
There's also a question on WebEx.
Okay, you got one?
Yeah. There's a follow-up question. Is the LAM project tied to the work that the US Aid Center for Resilience is doing on vulnerable populations backsliding into poverty? There might be some points of alignment as you also look into climate change-related economic shocks. Ethiopia is one of the countries being studied there.
Yes. We are working with the Resilience Office. We work with them on analysis in Malawi. Ethiopia, the mission is getting ready to ask us, I think, for follow-up. And we are coordinating with them. We do align with them. We did a joint project, you know, stovepipes, but we trying to avoid all of our institutional bureaucratic stovepipes to work directly with the Resilience Office. And we generated analysis. I didn't do this for Ethiopia, but in Malawi, we identified the characteristics of the least vulnerable households, because that's what you then want to promote as a beginning place to understand resilience is, well, these are the least vulnerable households. What are their characteristics? What's their pattern in the landscape? What's their impact? And then, obviously, you'd want to build on that. So that's what we started that conversation with Resilience Office. Not just the most vulnerable, which the project contracting officers representatives want to address, the Resilience Office on the other end. So we do, and Bangladesh as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for your presentation. So I have a couple of comments. I think when Brent, you started out, you made this comment, and paraphrasing here, it's amazing how we do all this planning without assuming that the environment is not going to change and without the geography, right? And I think that the sort of spatial dimension is very revealing. And I think when you put that against the temporal dimension, it's even more revealing. And I think part of what we're trying to do with the climate migration study is take that longer term perspective over space and time. But I want to come back a little bit to the social protection measures that Carlo presented. And I guess the question I have here is, I think the social protection measures you have, and I think the strategies of going from the household to the resilience and thinking about the scale up, I think are the right ways forward. The question is, I mean, do you, sitting where you are, and of course as part of the larger practice, do you think these social protection measures are able to keep up with the scale of change that is going on about you? I mean, in the sense of the nature of the increased frequency of the shocks and the extended kind of stresses you're going to face, and whether, I mean, the question I have is whether the social protection measures in themselves are also evolving to be more nimble and more mobile, because when I hear Vara talk about people who are displaced and they are in a dire stress, and I'm assuming that when they're in a certain geography and a place, they have access to the social protection measures, but when they're displaced and they're pushed out to a new location, they forfeit all those protection measures, and it's almost like the system isn't prepared to deal with it. So my question is, what is it that we, you know, the practice of this group is thinking about in terms of not just the scale up, but the mobility of those measures? And I say that because as part of the migration study, we are looking back, as I mentioned to you, at the portfolio of what is it that the bank is doing
in the portfolio projects that we are looking at, where we are acting on migration, displacement, but also on some of the resilience. And I think the nature of the measures we are finding are there, but they're very much tied to a place and a time and a person. And yet we're talking about a moving situation that is got enough levels of uncertainty, but really hitting the poorest the hardest. So I just wanted to have your thoughts on how we bring these dimensions together as part of the forward-looking that Steve was talking about.
Please. It's a free-for-all at this point.
Let me take this opportunity first to come back to a couple of points about the delivery service and the social connections. I think those are huge challenges, especially in poorer countries and especially in the Sahel. One of the ways we are addressing that is by creating some type of outreach service through the programs that we manage them. So, we focus in certain regions, we focus in certain communes. At the commune level, we're trying to build some kind of synergies with the people. We have some staff which is hired that facilitated that process of coordinating some of the activities and providing some of the services. We would like to have much better linkages also with health services. And, in Cameroon and in Burkina, we're trying to link to the some of the health projects, the results-based financing project, in order to be able to have more access to those areas. The other issue that you mentioned before is the issues of social connection. And what we found out is that most of the people that participate to these programs are people that have no connections. So these are people that, for example, we found in Niger, these were people that were not participating to tontines or saving mechanism or even funeral societies. They didn't contribute a small amount to the funeral societies. And once they basically started participating to these programs, they were introduced to this mechanism, then they were able to build those. So one of the things we're thinking about is that how can we create those kind of groups of people and how to facilitate these discussions within the group of people. Now, if the challenges increase, are we going to be able to face those challenges? The assumption is that we have, first of all, what I mentioned before in the presentation very, very quickly was the issue of footprint. If you have a very small-scale program, there is nothing else to blow a whistle and say, please come and help me and give me as much food aid you can. And there's nothing else I can do. But if I do have enough footprint, I know that I'm going to be able to have that capacity, not only of doing something with the people which are already covered by some kind of program, giving them additional money like they've done in Mexico, for example, a few years ago. That is one way how you can do that. Another one, if you're present in an area, just increase the number of beneficiaries which are in the area, give them some subsidies for a longer period of time. The other one is to expand horizontally. So how can you do that? And then, you need good mechanism. Once again, if your footprint is large enough, I'm not talking about 30% of the population covered, but if you at least have 5 or 10% of the population covered, that gives a kind of flexibility that you already have some people on the rolls. One of the things I did not mention, we talk a lot about, we are talking about social registries. It is something which has been promoted a lot, in several countries, and we're doing it in the Sahel. If you do have a social registry, then you have a list of potential beneficiaries. And using this list of potential beneficiaries, you can increase the number of people which are covered. So if you have in a certain commune or a certain village, you have covering about 20 or 30% of the population. If you have this available research registry, you can use some kind of criteria. So just pick up another 20% of the population, knowing that the village is being hit by some type of shock using the early warning system that you have. What is more challenging is to say, let's go outside somewhere else. And there, you need, if you have a good infrastructure and you have good nimble programs, then it's something you can do fairly quickly. Also, it's also important that one of the things we're trying to prove is that, having that type of footprint and having that type of basic coverage and expanding the programs is going to cost you less in the long run than providing food aid. There is one nexus also we're going to try to explore with, which is between the humanitarian aid and this social protection mechanism. And the immediate civil response when you have a flood. There are things that social protection mechanisms cannot do very well. Those are not some of the things. The immediate response is not something that goes very well. But when we are talking about IDPs and internal migration, what we have found out is that if you exclude the people which are in the camps, there are people that move back into some of the villages where they have no people that are relatives, and they put a huge amount of stress on those households that they live in those areas. What we've done, we've been able to scale up some of these programs with immediate, within 5 or 6 months. We're doing it in the northern part of Cameroon, in some of the areas where you have these people which are displaced.
Yes.
And also we have done that, in Niger, in the region when we had the Libya refugees, and they're doing also right now in Difa. So when we have those people which are, and the criteria that are used is what are the areas which are under stress because you have this influx of people which eventually will go away. And the measure that we use is resident households which we threw there. I remember looking at the Libyan refugees. You had these refugees which were wearing expensive soccer jerseys while the local children did not have any shoes. So you find yourself dealing with that. But a lot of interesting challenges, and I think while you go ahead with this work, I think we would love to to talk more and also find some interesting case studies which we could highlight.
Can I make one point? I think the elephant in the room in most of these issues is political economy, and it comes out in the most horrible ways. It's unbelievable that governments state governments in a federation tend to exclude people just because they belong to a different group, right? Irrespective of how vulnerable they are. And these social structures and these patronage structures are a major constraint. And that's what I think really destroys everything. But I think one more point I want to make is that if we are able to better estimate what happens when these more reliant become more resilient families fall, and then what investments need to be made to bring them back versus what investments are needed to just maintain them. I think that could be a powerful argument to make in terms of how investments are made, right? And you don't wait for people to fall off, then to kind of invest so much more to then pull them up. So I think if one is able to make those arguments, then at least we may be able to tackle this political economy from at least a macro perspective.
Great. Final comment. Anybody want it?
Well, that's a
Please,
big
Ann.
responsibility. I was going to cede my time here, but no, I guess just the query to both speakers whether national governments are looking at their programming areas in terms of climate exposure. Has that really entered the conversation yet? Because even the very nice maps that Brent was showing were kind of looking at past events, right? And that's very kind of a few years in scale. But when we're talking about trying to make outlays kind of more responsive over time and countries and even area-based development more resilient, that's going to require a much longer time scale, as Kanta said. And so I just wondered whether in any of the dialogue at the macro scale that that you're having with government of Ethiopia or these other governments, are people looking at that subnational level and looking at exposed regions? Is that yet part of the conversation, or are we not there?
I think those questions are being raised, again, maybe because of political economy issues within Ethiopia currently. There are some very interesting conversations that arise because of that around some governments are more willing to acknowledge that there are internal differences that may be leading to their macro political economic problems, and those that are responsive to that will listen to that message, and we'll start to ask some of the questions that we get out. Others, we just know we can't go there, and it's a case-by-case basis. We all know that, and the leverage that we have is going to be very interesting going forward, and the response will be equally interesting. So let's stay engaged. But yes, I mean, we saw several that were willing to do that. Bangladesh was one that was willing to look internally.
Ron, any reaction to that, or?
There are, we have, in the Sahel, we've been able to engage governments in a lot of discussions and, get these discussions about these programs. And I think this has been, if you're looking back 5 years ago, none of these countries had any programs whatsoever. So, we're doing a lot of progress to that. There are issues and elements, especially with, refugees. I mean, like in Cameroon, people that just they want to have a national ID in order to be able to participate into the program. Otherwise, you cannot participate into the program. So there are challenges. But, again, if you go into the idea of, building these perspectives or building systems, building information systems, they show where the hotspots are and where the people which are covered, and how better it is to being able to have something that also reduces the stress. This is something which convinces governments that it's much better to invest in these kind of programs than wait for some kind of a crisis and have angry people demonstrating. I think this has been, so I'm positive.
Okay, we will leave it on that positive note then. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to our respondents. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you to everybody online and those of you in the room. Again, do we have another one in the series, or was this it for now?
No, we have another one coming, a couple more coming up. I think the next one is supposed to be on...
Next one might be in February on climate insurance.
This is from the previous.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again very much, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
It's for the administrator and chairman of Rent Users. No.
Thank you.
Head of SOCOM.